The day after, President Donald Trump answers our question following special counsel Robert Mueller's testimony on Capitol Hill. Increased visibility. Pope Francis gives an important Vatican position to a woman. Stepping down. Why people took to the streets to celebrate in Puerto Rico. And raising questions. We speak with a cardinal who has concerns about an upcoming meeting at the Holy See. On EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, July 25th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. Washington reacts to the congressional testimony of Robert Mueller. After hours of questions for the former special counsel, President Trump claimed victory, and now Democratic leadership could be backing away from proposals to impeach the president. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports.
Good evening, Wyatt. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi called Mueller's testimony a crossing of the threshold, raising public awareness about what his investigation found. That includes evidence of Russian interference in the 2016 election. But now all eyes are on 2020. The president believes the testimony of former special counsel Robert Mueller will help his 2020 campaign.
And you know what? The Democrats thought they could win an election like this. I think they hurt themselves very badly for 2020.
His response after Mueller took hours of questions yesterday about the Russia investigation.
The performance was obviously not very good. He had a lot of problems, but what he showed more than anything else is that this whole thing has been 3 years of embarrassment and waste of time for our country.
Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi saw it differently after Mueller said his report did not totally exonerate the president.
The American people now realize more fully the crimes that were committed against our Constitution.
The question of impeaching President Trump may be tabled for now. Today, Pelosi indicating the focus of her Democratic-led chamber will be policy.
We will own August and make it too hot to handle for the Senate not to take up our bills.
And Democratic Chairman of the House Intelligence Committee Adam Schiff says there currently is no prospect of removing the president through impeachment.
The only way he's leaving office, at least at this point, is by being voted out. And I think our efforts need to be made in every respect to make sure we turn out our people.
When the former special counsel Robert Mueller was asked yesterday if Russia will continue to interfere in U.S. elections as it did in 2016, he said it wasn't a single attempt. They're doing it as we sit here, and he says Russia expects to do it during the 2020 campaign. At the White House, Mark Irons, EWTN News Nightly.
Thanks, Mark. The Department of Justice says it's bringing back the death penalty. The federal government will execute people for the first time since 2003. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi brings us the story. He also tells us about Catholic teaching on capital punishment.
Wyatt, we're not talking about state executions, which have continued, but the federal executions, which haven't taken place in 16 years. Now the federal government says they're going to execute 5 death row inmates starting in December.
With these words, Catholic Attorney General William Barr brings back the federal death penalty.
The Justice Department upholds the rule of law, and we owe it to the victims and their families to carry forward the sentence imposed by our justice system.
But those who write American law debate the reinstatement.
We know that we have executed innocent people in this country before, and we ought to make sure we're not doing that. I don't think there's a rhyme and a reason to doing it now, except that Trump is having a bad news week, and Mueller was yesterday, so he needed to do what he does, which is change the conversation and do that.
Texas Republican Louis Gohmert was a judge who sentenced people to death.
It is very important that we have a fair system. So I'm not opposed to its implementation, but you got to make sure the safeguards are there so that innocent people don't end up there.
Although the church always allowed for the death penalty, St. John Paul II taught its need to protect modern society was very rare, if not practically non-existent. And in 2015, Pope Francis urged Congress to end the death penalty.
Since every life is sacred, every human person is endowed with unalienable dignity, and society can only benefit from the rehabilitation of those convicted of crimes.
Last year, he revised the catechism. The death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person. Moral theologian Thomas Petrie explained.
The Holy Father is not changing the church teaching because the Pope cannot change church teaching. The church teaches that the state has a right to use the death penalty. The Holy Father, in this revision, following upon John Paul II's revision in 1997, is simply saying that given certain circumstances in modern society, the death penalty really ought not to be used. It's inadmissible, he says.
A Catholic organization that fights the death penalty, called Catholic Mobilizing Network, says the reinstatement is unconscionable. Former President Barack Obama in 2014 launched a nationwide investigation after a botched state execution in Oklahoma. Today, the Department of Justice says they've wrapped up that probe and executions at the federal level can continue. At the Capitol, Jason Calvi, EWTN News Nightly.
Joining me now is Bob Cusack, editor-in-chief for The Hill. Bob, welcome back in the studio.
Hey, Wyatt.
Why move to bring the death penalty back at the federal level now, 2 decades later?
It's a great question. I mean, this move from the Justice Department really came out of nowhere, and it's automatically going to be a campaign issue. I imagine it's going to be brought up in the debates, in the Democratic debates next week. And certainly this president has said that he has been tough on crime. This is part of that. And he has an attorney general that he is very comfortable with now in Bill Barr. But this really did come out of nowhere. No one was expecting this.
How do you think it will resonate with President Trump's voters? I mean, do you think he's kind of playing to his base here?
I think he is playing to his base. I mean, the polls are split, and it's public opinion has changed over the years, but this divides the country, and I think it will ignite a debate on it. What members have said is, and certainly Congressman Richmond said is, listen, people have been executed who have been innocent. That is a fact. But DNA is better than it's ever been. So I do think that this is going to be a debate that will go all the way into next year.
Obviously, for Catholics, this connects to the pro-life issue when it comes to the death penalty. How do you think this decision reconciles the administration's message of being pro-life?
I think that'll be discussed. I mean, I certainly think that this president has been clear. Now, in a prior life, he was pro-choice, but he is pro-life now, and he has been he has supported police, he has supported victims, and he thinks this is part of it, to be tough on the criminals who did heinous crimes.
Politically, you had touched on this.
Yeah.
Politically, how does this widen the divide between Republicans and Democrats ahead of 2020?
It does widen them because I imagine, and we've already seen some reaction from some of the 2020 candidates on the Democratic side, they don't support this decision. Democrats, by and large, will not. However, it will start a conversation of, well, where was Joe Biden on the crime bill, which certainly changed the law on executions, and how did Kamala Harris deal with this? So now, but as far as their present position, I think it's going to be very different than Donald Trump's.
Well, while you're here, Bob, I want to ask you about what happened on Wednesday with Bob Mueller being on the Hill. Just give me your overall impressions about what went on there, and does someone benefit politically from this?
I think that President Trump benefits tremendously from this. The hearings really fell flat. There was no big news that came out of it. There were snippets here and there, but we had already seen the report, and he stuck to the report. And also, there were a lot of questions. There was a lot of confusion. Robert Mueller was not as sharp as he was in his press conference earlier this year. That dominated the whole storyline. Did it move the needle on impeachment? It did not. The Democrats, by and large, they don't have the votes for impeachment. There are 95 of them, roughly, that voted recently for impeachment. They've got to get to 218, and they're not going to get any help on the Republican side. Justin Amash left the Republican Party over this issue. He's an independent now. So they're not even halfway of the Democratic caucus. So they're divided on this, and at some point the Democrats are going to have to say, I think this year we're moving on from impeachment, but they haven't said it yet.
Okay, we'll continue to watch and see if they do or drop that issue. Bob Cusack, editor-in-chief for The Hill. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Wyatt.
North Korea holds its first missile launch in more than 2 months.
맞으며 북한이 한반도에서 군사적 긴장 완화 노력에 도움이 되지 않는
Officials in South Korea say the weapons were new short-range ballistic missiles. The test may have been an attempt to pressure Washington amid stalled negotiations with Pyongyang. Puerto Rico's embattled governor says he will resign. It came as good news to people who have been calling for him to step down for nearly 2 weeks. Demonstrators took to the streets to celebrate the resignation. Ricardo Rossello was found to have been sending crude and insulting chat messages with his top advisors. The 40-year-old Democrat is the first chief executive to resign in the U.S. territory's modern history. The Holy See's permanent observer to the United Nations is urging tolerance and mutual acceptance in the Middle East. Archbishop Bernardito Alza spoke earlier this week at a UN Security Council debate on the region. He says the lack of unity between Israelis and Palestinians are fostering a violent environment, and it's putting innocent lives at risk. Pope Francis makes more changes to the Holy See press office. Christiane Murray is the Holy Father's new deputy spokeswoman. The 57-year-old is a Brazilian journalist. She joined Vatican Radio in 1995. She will work with Matteo Bruni, the new director of the Holy See's press office. Coming up, analysis of the budget agreement between the president and congressional leaders. Welcome back. Today, members of the House of Representatives are voting on a budget deal agreed to by the White House and congressional Democrats, but a conservative group is blasting the agreement as being, quote, fiscally egregious. In a statement from Heritage Action, the advocacy organization affiliated with the Heritage Foundation, it reads in part, if President Trump and congressional Republicans cannot achieve a fiscally sane agreement with congressional Democrats, they should walk away. No deal is better than a bad deal. Joining me now is Justin Bogie, Senior Policy Analyst in Fiscal Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. Justin, welcome in. What are your main concerns about this budget agreement as it stands right now?
I think there's a couple of major concerns here. The first concern is that they're pairing a debt limit increase with a deal to raise these spending caps. The debt limit's a very important issue. This basically allows the federal government to borrow as much as it wants over the next 2 years. And then secondly, we have a $322 billion boost in funding through this bill, and none of it is being paid for.
So then you also point out that President Trump promised the American people he would never sign another spending bill like the $1.3 trillion one he threatened to veto in 2018. So if this passes, how do you think this impacts the president's fiscal legacy, if you will?
The president also claimed at one point during his campaign that he was going to wipe out the entire national debt within 8 years. You know, a pretty big claim. And he's put forth some good policies. His 3 budget proposals have really cut the size of the federal government, but this bill just completely flies in the face of that. This could add $1.7 trillion to the national debt over the next 10 years. It's very concerning. It's really no better than President Obama at this point.
Earlier today, President Trump encouraged Republican lawmakers to support the deal. It comes just days after the House Freedom Caucus released a statement saying its members would not vote for it. How significant is that? And does those congressional Republicans put this into jeopardy at all, being passed?
Nothing I've heard at this point makes me think that there's a real risk that this bill will fail. They'll depend mainly on Democrat votes to get this through, and then in the Senate, Republicans will probably support it. Because of their need for national defense funding. But it certainly should speak to the president that there are a lot of Republicans against this, a lot of people who have supported him in the past.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the concerns. Tell me about the positives. I mean, to your point, I think you had mentioned that there was, includes this an increase for the military. Mm-hmm. We've also mentioned on yesterday's show there was agreement reportedly includes protection for pro-life policies.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I think if you want to look at the positives, it's good that we're not going to face a default on the national debt. That would throw the markets into a real chaos and would have long-term effects. From the military standpoint, this does give the military more funding. It's not as much as the president wanted or that the Department of Defense would have wanted, but it does give them certainty over the next 2 years. They're not going to be having to worry about will they have funding and what that level will be. So it does help from that standpoint. And as you mentioned also, it does protect certain conservative policies from the rider process in the appropriations.
I know that the election is still a year away, but how do you think all of this is going to resonate with voters? Or do you think by the time we get to the election, it will or not?
Well, I think one reason that they're doing this deal now is to get it out of the way before the election. I think it's something everyone should really be concerned about. You know, a child today is born with about $50,000 in debt. By the time that child is 30 years old, their share will increase by about $85,000. So this is something that's not going away. The longer we wait to make reforms, the worse the situation is going to be. So everyone should care about this.
Okay, we'll continue to follow this budget deal and see how it all plays out. Justin Bogie, Senior Policy Analyst in Fiscal Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Up next. Cardinal Gerhard Muller tells us his concerns over the upcoming meeting of bishops on the Amazon region. And EWTN News Nightly is hitting the road with the Vice President. Today marks the 51st anniversary of Humanae Vitae. Pope Paul VI's landmark letter rejected artificial birth control and reaffirmed the Church's teaching on marriage. Pope Francis declared Pope Paul VI a saint last year. Welcome back. As bishops prepare to gather in the Vatican for a meeting called a synod on the Amazon, critics are voicing concern. The Amazon is a massive region in South America that encompasses Brazil, Peru, and Colombia, among other countries. This October, church leaders will be looking at how to better serve Catholics there. Its population, mainly indigenous people, face devastating environmental threats as well as discrimination and exploitation. The working document meant to guide the discussions calls the Amazon, quote, a source of God's revelation. Joining us now is Cardinal Gerhard Muller, former head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Your Eminence, you have been a vocal critic of the premise of this synod. What are your concerns?
I think this is a gathering synod of Catholic bishops, and the basis must be the revelation of God in Jesus Christ and the doctrine of the Catholic Church. And therefore I missed in this document certain Christocentrism, the doctrine about the triune God and the incarnation is only spoken about the experiences of some people living there in the Amazonas region, or those people who are speaking about the Amazonas region, and they want to make it a new paradigm for the whole church, and that cannot be.
So obviously that's one big concern. The other thing that people are thinking about is that the bishops are expected to study about the possibility of ordaining married men in the remote areas to the priesthood because of a shortage of clergy in the Amazon. Mm-hmm. Why is that so controversial when the church does allow that in some special circumstances?
Yeah, the conditions for the sacraments, and especially for the sacrament of ordination, are everywhere the same, and there is needed those men who are ready and have the preparation, and they are willingly to offer their life that can become the successors of the apostles in the service of a bishop or priest or deacon. And surely in some regions there are a big lack of priests, but we cannot overcome this only with some practical attitudes, but we must go deeper in the mission and the vocation. And Jesus said to us always, there are not enough workers in the fields of God, and we must pray that the Lord of the crop has to send the workers for the church in this ordained service of the bishops and the priests.
As I say, Your Eminence, you have been very vocal about this and raising your concerns. What do you say to your critics who say you should be promoting unity in the church right now and not necessarily criticizing what the Holy Father and the other bishops are doing?
Yeah, I don't criticize nobody, but I have to say I have a responsibility for the doctrine of the church as all the bishops, and it is not, nobody is allowed to say only his own thinking and then saying we are outside of all possible critic, because we don't have positivism of the magisterium. But we are saying on the council, the Second Vatican Council, that all the theology and all the doctrine and mission of the Church is based in the Bible, in the apostolic tradition, and in the definitions of the Council, which were made along the long time of the history of the Church.
Well, we will continue to look forward and cover the Synod, which is upcoming in October. Cardinal Gerhard Muller, coming to us from Rome, thanks so much. Mm-hmm. Last week, Dr. Lena Wynn was ousted as the head of Planned Parenthood. Tonight on EWTN Pro-Life Weekly, Catherine Hadro has Abby Johnson's reaction. She's a former employee of the nation's largest abortion provider turned pro-life leader.
I just felt like this is a woman who is shocked, who is betrayed, and she needs to see that we in the pro-life movement are welcoming of her.
Johnson also describes her experience as an employee at Planned Parenthood. You can see more of Catherine Hadro's interview tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern, right here on EWTN. And before we go tonight, stay tuned tomorrow as White House correspondent Mark Irons travels to Jacksonville, Florida. He's following Vice President Mike Pence and presidential advisor Ivanka Trump. The two will speak about providing second chances for former inmates receiving help at Operation New Hope. And they're highlighting the pledge to America's workers. Watch tomorrow for Mark's report from Florida right here on News Nightly. And we wish Godspeed to all of the members of our White House team who will be on the ground in Florida tomorrow. And that wraps up our newscast for tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.